Introducing Xstate Store. Oh boy, I have not been the biggest fan of Xstate historically. It's not that I think it's bad, it's that I think it's pretty heavy for most use cases. A dedicated proper state machine is nothing to be scoffed at. They're very useful for very complex state management problems. But I find that most state management problems are not that complex. That's why I love tools like React Query, because they take this thing that we expect to be complex, like fetching data from the server, they make it 2 lines of code in a really scalable, maintainable fashion. But we're talking about things other than data fetching, like, I don't know, logic for a game running locally, really complex user interfaces with selection and things like that built in. That's when you need real state management tools. And while I've seen Xstate and I understand the value it could potentially bring, I still find myself using zustand and Jodi more often than not. That all said, TK Dodo was similar, and he's the lead maintainer of React Query and TanStack Query. So for him to start moving away from zustand says a lot, and for him to make a blog post like this says even more. So let's dig in. Introducing Xstate Store. Before we introduce Xstate Store, I have to introduce the sponsor of today's episode. Today's sponsor is a component, but it's not just any component. I mean, what component can afford to sponsor a video like this? It's the best component, specifically the best grid ever made. I'm not exaggerating when I say AG Grid is the thing you should use if you have a complex grid with data, filtering, and all the things that make it annoying. If you've ever had to build a grid like this, you know how painful it is. And when you see how easy AG Grid makes it, you'll understand why they are the industry standard. And they're not like the industry standard where like 30% of people use them. Over 90% of the Fortune 500 is using AG Grid for their grids. And it's not like they don't look at what's going on in the ecosystem, because if you scroll a bit further, you'll see Tanner Lindsley here, who is a huge part of my success, as well as the creator of TanStack Table, which is a competitor to AG Grid that AG Grid sponsors. They're the lead sponsor on an open source alternative, even though AG Grid itself is open source. It's nuts, but they know how valuable what they built is, and they know that if you have a grid in your application and you need it to be good, AG Grid is probably what you're looking for. The vast majority is open source. They only charge for some of the powerful enterprise plugins, so you should give it a shot today and see what you think. Huge shout out to AG Grid for sponsoring today's video. Check them out today at soydev.link/ag-grid. I'm super happy with the tech stack that I'm currently using, especially around state management. Obviously, server state's managed by React Query. For forms, I use React Hook Form. What remains can very often be put into the URL, which really is a joy with TanStack Router. Yeah, huge call out here. There is so much state that I see people managing and like bringing in Redux for that is shit that should have just been in your URL bar. Like one example, I don't want to roast a specific person. They don't watch my videos enough that they will even know it was them. They had convinced themselves that they absolutely needed Redux in their app as their data layer for everything, because they had the use case of sometimes when a user clicks on a thing, it opens up as a modal on top of the current page. Motherfucker, put it in a query param. Please put it in a query param. The general test I have for this is, would you reasonably want it to be there still on a refresh? If the answer is no, put it in a state machine. If the answer is yes, put it in the goddamn URL. That aside, let's talk about the state machines for that small set of things that isn't syncing server data, that isn't the things in your form, and that isn't something that you should want in the URL bar because you want it to be there on refresh. The subset of the subset we have left, that is client state. And within this, we do need better solutions. So let's dig into those. As TK says here, he uses zustand, which is his favorite client state manager to date. This has been my recommended stack for quite some time. Okay, the router is quite new, but the concept isn't. Yep, all line there. And I'm not known for easily switching state managers. Every once in a while, something new comes out. But in order for me to switch, it has to be quite a lot better than what I'm currently working with. Yeah, I haven't switched off zustand for a while. I'm very curious to see if I can get baited off. We'll see. Because according to TK, today might be that time. Xstate/store. When I first heard about Xstate/store, I was immediately intrigued by a couple of things. For one, it was made by David, and whatever he builds usually overlaps conceptually with my thinking. Yeah, David is phenomenal. He's the one who did the stop using use effect talk that went quite viral. Great dude, really smart. Every conversation I've had with him has been incredible. But Xstate reflects how smart he is, which isn't necessarily a great thing, because I don't want my state management solution to be really smart. I want it to be really stupid. The stupider, the better for state machines, from my experience. But the second point here is that he felt like David totally nailed the API in Xstate Store. On a first glance, it looks like zustand and Redux Toolkit had a child, combining the best of both libraries. So let's take a look. This is similar to the one he already has with his working with zustand article. Oh boy. Create store, use Xstate store, use selector from Xstate store React. So that's how we'll be doing the selections. Nice to have that not so tightly tied to the library directly. Create a store. Okay, now we're getting into things that are different already. We have the context, which is the actual values the store holds, and then the transitions, which is a separate object that I'm assuming infers types off of this first one. This is a thing that zustand sucks at. Zustand has a combine helper. That is the solution that they recommend. So in this example, you have to manually type out everything. You can't use inference because otherwise increase wouldn't know bears exists because you can't infer a key's existence in another key in the same object. I've been to hell and back with that fun TypeScript fact. So their recommendation, if you don't want to define that directly, you can use combine. Combine lets you pass two stores and combine them together. And since the first one is an argument, you can pass things there and then infer the types so you have access to them in the second. But you have to grab the combine zustand middleware in order to mangle the variables types inference into the actual setters and like actions code. Not great. Thankfully, seems like Xstate store just handles that because you can pass two different things to the create store helper, which for most use cases is the right way to do that. So I dig this so far. And then we can export custom hooks here where we have useSelector. The first argument is the store. The second argument is the thing you want to select off the store. So now this hook will only update when state.context.bears changes. This is cool. I like the idea of context and transitions being different things you have to select from here. Very different from what I'm used to. I think I like the strong separation between those though. Create store is the main function we need to use from Xstate store, which is split into two parts, the context and transitions. Context is the state, and transitions are similar to actions. One could say this is only marginally different to zustand, so what's intriguing? Well, to me, there's quite many things. Let's break them down. Oh, look at that, the TypeScript part. Just called that out. It can infer types of the store from the initial context. This is pretty great, and something that was usually a lot more verbose with zustand. There are some ways to make this better with the combined middleware. Pre-read, no, I've been through all of this the same exact way TK has. That's why I'm excited to read this. We're very aligned with the way we build and think, so not surprised here that he called out the exact same thing. The only thing that we had to manually type here is the event passed into increased population. That's a very fair point. Since increased population has an event that is an amount, you have to write the type for that part. Otherwise, everything's inferred. That's really cool. Also, it's a subtle thing, but see that bears and fish are different keys? Notice how in this one, increased population, we're only returning bears. A lot of state libraries would take what you return here and set that as the new state, so it would wipe fish. But both zustand and Xstate store are smart enough to only update the keys you pass here. It can make it annoying to delete fish because you have to manually pass things to it to say, hey, wipe that value. But the fact that you can just update the key you're using and it's smart enough to not touch the other things is really, really handy. So transitions. The store has a natural split between state and actions, which is something that I recommend doing with zustand as well. Except that in Xstate/store, transitions aren't part of the store state, so we don't have to select them to perform updates or exclude them when persisting the store somewhere. Oh, okay. You have my attention. I didn't even think of that. It is kind of clunky that you have to select. Let me just pull up an actual code base that I have that's using these things. Okay, cool. Pick thing. That's easy. Store. Image selection. Here's the image selection store. Here, I defined the state because it was easier than doing all the combines. And then down here, I define the actual functions. All the types are inferred because I pass select store to the create call. But then when I want to have things like use ID toggle, I have to pass, after I select the toggle ID function off of state.toggleID selection. It's not clear that this is a function, and I still have to select it off the store as though it is a value. This will never change. I shouldn't have to select to grab this. I should be able to just call it. Is selected, absolutely I should have to select for. Sorry for the overuse of the term select here. But in order to know that you've selected a specific image, I do need to grab that off of the store directly. That code would be way less annoying with transitions. Let me see the actual example with that. Speaking of updates, if we don't select actions from the store, how do we actually trigger them? Oh, actually, one more call out on the transition thing. You don't have to manually exclude them when you persist the store. That's a very annoying but very real issue. I have another store in here for, is it preferences? Yeah, use preferences. And in here, I'm doing it right with the combine, but I'm also storing it locally. Theoretically, I should manually be nuking this function before doing the storage, but I trust zustand and local storage enough to just throw and not use this function. But if it was storing anything else that can't be serialized into JSON, I'd probably have to manually remove it before doing the storage. But if all of that is just part of the context and the transitions are separate, oh, that's really nice. So how do we actually call them then? Store.send, type, increase population by 10. Interesting. So this has to be inferred from the actual type definition from the store. Does store get imported separately? So I actually export the store here? I must, yeah. So you have to export the store, and if you want to send events to it, you just call it directly. That's really nice. I have done hacks for this for so long. You can do this with zustand, and I've done this with zustand before. It is not built for it. It wouldn't be an Xstate-like library if the store itself wasn't event-driven. Fair. That is a huge difference, where with zustand, you're defining functions. With Xstate and other state machines, you're defining types of events that operate on the state. Again, this is something I also recommend doing with zustand, because events are a lot more descriptive than setters are, and they make sure the logic lives in the store, not in the UI that is triggering the update. Oh man, that is triggering. I've seen so many code bases where very specific state update patterns were encoded in like on-click logic instead of those being part of the actual store. Ugh. So a store.send, we're triggering a transition from one state to the next. It takes an object with a type, which is derived from the keys of the transition object that we define in our store. And of course, it's totally type safe. This is definitely very similar to Redux Toolkit, which made Redux usable. But let's talk about selectors next. Zustand is built on selectors as well, but notice how the create store itself isn't a hook. We have to pass it to the use selector, which requires us to pass a selector function too. I'm going to show one other code base. Give me a sec. This one's kind of broken because I was doing a lot of weird stuff in this project and never fixed it. But I have a store in here for the video call app state in Ping. If you're not familiar with Ping somehow, it's a video call app that I built for my company that went through Y Combinator to make it easier to do live collaborations on Twitch and wherever else. It has the most complex state of any application I've ever built by an order of magnitude, even compared to Twitch. And it has been fun to work with. So here I have my call provider state. I'm using Agora as a WebRTC layer. And here we have the call state, the participants, the volume state, and all of these things, including the functions. The problem that I ran into regularly is that I need these things to be called without it relying on React. I don't want to bind hooks to make leave call and kick and the updates to these things all work inside of React. So what I do here is when you call the create Agora call store function, I create the Agora client, I do logic here. I actually comment out what each of these sections is to make it clear for people who are hopping into this code base, because it's not easy to get around. I have the new store, it's erroring because something isn't installed, whatever. What this is doing, if you ignore the red squiggly lines, is I'm calling the vanilla create function from zustand because I want to be able to call this stuff without React. So here, by creating this store with all these values, I can now bind it to things related to the call state. So here I have this update participants function that will update the participants map to be whatever the Agora remote users map returns. And I call this function to trigger this update on all of the different event types. So now, whenever a user joins, leaves, publishes, or unpublishes a track, this update call gets triggered. And we are not writing any React code yet. Everything here so far has been vanilla JavaScript. Here I have the same for volume levels, where on volume indicator, I update volume levels by going through all the users and updating their current volume level. I have an on connection state change. It's the same. And at the end, I return the store. But this async function here that I wrote, it's not even async. This all binds as like .ons and .thens, so it doesn't even have to be async. This function does the creation of the Agora client to do the WebRTC call. It creates the store with the default state. It binds all of the updaters to that specific client, and then it returns the store with the client included in it. And now, if we go back to here, again, ignore the fact that I don't have my NPM modules installed. That's why all the things are erroring out. Here, I call Xstate for the Agora call store, and I do this in effect because React has no concept of an initializer that only runs once. So I have to do it in a fucking effect. I got in a long back and forth with Dan Abramov about this like 2 years ago. We both concluded each other are wrong, but there should be a use memo with cleanup function in React. The fact that there isn't is insane. Anyways, here I have the code that initializes that Agora call store. Can I even see what the type error is? It's just preferring default exports. Fuck you. Why is that a rule? Oh, I added the Airbnb rules as a joke at some point. I forgot to delete them. That's what happened there. Okay. All the errors are gone now. Fuck the Airbnb rules. They make literally no sense whatsoever. Talking about Redux stuff, and now we're doing Airbnb rules. This is old. Anyways. Errors are gone. My use effect creates the new store and we set it. And in the return, this is the cleanup. We leave with the client and then I destroy the store. And then I use the zustand Agora provider, which is literally just a local context provider, so that every child here now has access to this store. This seems a little chaotic, and honestly it is, but the reason I did it this way is I wanted to be able to bind not just what state exists, but most of the changes for that state inside of this one vanilla.js function call. And what this has enabled is I can take this Agora call store call and use it with other frameworks, other tools, other code bases, and it just works. The catch is I have to now bind this to zustand, which I do by using the Agora provider store hook that comes from this create context call, but then the store gets passed in manually here, and it's a vanilla store. In fact, I'm calling create here from zustand in order to transform this vanilla store into a React store. There's a lot of layers here that feel a little bit extra, but with the way that this works in Xstate store, none of that work is necessary anymore, and that's actually pretty cool. So the framework agnostic part, bigger deal than it might seem. Even if you're just using things in React, you should not have all of the logic I have here in React. I should not have a bunch of use effects here handling all of these event types. I don't care. It shouldn't be necessary. It shouldn't block the creation. This guarantees that whenever this store is created, everything you might need is initialized and instantiated there too. And that is a good thing. The point I'm trying to make here is that framework agnostic benefits you even if you're using the main framework. Even if you're using React, something being framework agnostic lets you write logic that shouldn't be in React outside of it. And that's a good thing. It makes your React code significantly simpler. On the topic of simpler, upgrade to state machines. Oh boy. State machines have the reputation of being a complex tool to adopt, which is why a lot of people shy away from them. And I think it's true that they are likely overkill for most state that gets managed in web apps. However, state usually evolves over time, getting more complex as requirements are added. I've seen lots of code in use reducers or external zustand stores where I thought, this should obviously be a state machine. Why isn't there one? The answer is usually that by the time we realize it should have been a state machine, it's already so complex that creating one out of it is not an easy thing to do anymore. Fair. Fun fact, when we had all this complexity in Ping, we did sketch out what the store would look like to do this with Xstate properly as a real state machine. And I concluded having 3 different stores was significantly easier. And I'm pretty sure we were right still. But the idea of being able to promote from a store to a real state machine, that's exciting. It has an upgrade path to convert a store into a state machine. Might not be something you think you need, but it's exactly the thing that you're happy you have available for free if you do end up needing it. Let me see this. I'm actually quite curious. Setup compares Xstate store to other popular state management libraries. So we import create machine instead of create store. We move the first argument to the context property. Second argument transitions to on. We wrap the assignments in an assign action. And we just structure context and event from the first argument. There. Yeah, that's not too bad. It's not too bad at all. It also means you can see all the cool things that Xstate does because we're already here. Turn ideas into diagrams and code in minutes. Shout out to Stately and all the hard work David's been doing on this stuff, making it way easier to reason about your complex state and printing out diagrams. You can actually take an Xstate like state machine and generate a diagram like this for it, which is really cool stuff. If they were smart, they'd be charging $99 a year for that. Good reference. Back to the article. When my article Working with Zustand came out, it was very well received because it provided some opinionated guidance for working with a tool that mostly stays out of your way. This is very important. Zustand is so beautifully minimal, like hilariously so, that you can do things a million different ways and they'll all work, but a lot of them suck to maintain. So having someone like TK making recommendations like that was huge, because not everybody's going to be a clever motherfucker like me and come up with this insane way to bind all of your Agora state to Zustand directly. So for mere mortals, having somebody like TK holding your hand through it is huge. But Xstate store is a nice alternative. As TK said here, it lets you structure and update your store the way you want to. Total freedom that can also be a bit paralyzing. I've even felt that before as Zustand. Like, the right way was hard to figure out, so I didn't know which way to go with. Xstate/store feels to me like a more opinionated way of achieving the same thing. The fact that the opinions overlap a lot, like really a lot, with how I would do things myself makes it a very good choice for me. I think I agree. I'm going to give this a shot. I do want to call out one last thing, though, from Sebastian Lorber. I often agree with TK Dodo, but not here. Store.send, type, increase population, no. Store.increase population. Isn't the second version more convenient? What makes the code event-driven? It's not interface to dispatch. It's the name events in past tense and considering that they already happened. It's not a critique of Xstate store. It's understandable that they encourage event-driven code as a good middle ground to adopting like finite state machines or Xstate. Note that Redux is already encouraging event-driven code as well. Using an event-driven interface to trigger imperative state transitions does not make sense to me. You should decide, do you want event-driven or indirection, or do you not? If your event looks like type set something, you'd be better off just calling store.setSomething. I like Xstate store, but the part I like less is the store.send API. In many situations, I decide purposefully to not make my code event-driven because indirection has a cost. I'm more likely to use Xstate store if there is an option to call store.setSomething. And as you can see, this ended up being a disagreement about whether or not event-driven makes sense most of the time. I slightly lean Dominic's direction, but I can understand both. Like in this example here, I probably shouldn't be writing this update function here. Like update participants shouldn't be me updating here. This should be an event type that exists on the store that is then like triggered by these Agora client events. So I almost ran into both sides issues when I wrote this way. And at the same time, I wouldn't want that update code to be exposed. Like the events I want exposed to the developer consuming this are different from the events I want access to internally. So on one hand, I hear TK's argument that everything being event-driven makes the reasoning about this better overall. But on the other hand, Zustand's more brute force, make a setter if you want to solution, let me do something like this without having to expose it externally. I don't want to have to expose an update participants function just so it could be called in this definition. I want that functionality to be defined here and consumed here, and then the actual values to be exposed elsewhere. And if the store requires me to expose all of the update methods, those are now accessible in all of the places in my code base, even if I don't want them to be elsewhere. And the solution for that would be I'd have to name this terribly, like internal don't call update participants, something like that. And I hate that. So yeah, as always, there are goods and bads, checks and balances, good reasons and bad reasons, all sorts of things to consider when you're looking at something like this. All of these smart people have put out really useful insights here, but I'm curious what you guys think. Are you excited about Xstate Store or are you going to stick with Zustand? Until next time, peace nerds.